Hi, this is the KOV from Bali. The reason we're here has nothing to do with the 10th anniversary of the Vintage Rolex Asylum or nothing to do with the beautiful view and to enjoy the luxury this private jet villa has to offer. But I want to touch base once more on controversial topics after last season's video. And we need a triggering environment to up my douche level a little bit more for you to write a resentful comment. Now, I'm here to tell you vintage is superior. And if you hate Rolex, you don't like watches, or you just don't understand it. Of course, for this video, I'm wearing a vintage Rolex. In this case, a Daytona 6239 Paul Newman with the so-called tricolore dial T-Swiss T large that was only made in 1967, the very early configuration with the 300 UPH bezel. Let's have a look. Before being accused of marking my own homework, let's start by saying that I don't praise vintage watches and Rolex just because I happen to be selling it. In fact, it's the other way around. I deal in Rolex and other vintage watches because I think they're praiseworthy. It's a choice we've made a long time ago, as our passion lies here. We understand and share the belief in this product, and it brings us much joy. If a monetary motivation would have been paramount, I'd probably opt for trading modern timepieces instead. Well, there's no point in denying I'm a capitalist, but I prefer to make money doing business with objects that inspire me. Yes, I'm biased, and this pleading isn't going to be entirely objective. Hence, I opened with my conclusion. But today, I hope to give you an understanding about my preference of vintage over modern and explain it is foolish to dislike or underplay the pivotal role of Rolex. So, what is vintage? The term vintage comes from winemaking, where it refers to the production process with grapes from a particular year, and moreover, it signifies a quality standard. Ever heard of the saying, aging like fine wine? In any case, the term is a bit vague and it's more difficult to pin down, unlike for instance antique, which is something of at least 100 years old. By now this appellation has been exploited in so many fields that it perhaps became a tad hollow. In my opinion, a watch only deserves this honorific title if it proved itself to withstand the test of time, both aesthetically as well as mechanically. It is fair to say it should probably be at least 20 years old before we can pass any such judgment on it. By extension, I would argue there are some watches from this millennium that could be qualified as vintage, whilst there are also models from the 20th century that are merely old watches. The debate can be elaborated by adding the growing neo-vintage segment, and arguably rarity might play a part too. I, for instance, doubt if most current Rolex would ever be regarded as future classics, since there are so many of them. It makes the collectability just less prevalent. Why should one opt for vintage? Currently, it's all about quantity and speed. Modern production methods obviously make today's watches superior in terms of precision and finishing. However, this is at the expense of the charm that relies on more artisanal craftsmanship when optimized machinery wasn't available yet. It can often be found in very small details. And craftsmanship is also reflected in the quality and durability of a watch. Provided that it is maintained, it will outlast you by generations. You can't say the same about most of the other practical products that were bought in the same era. But your prestigious timekeeper is still ticking away merrily. Fashion is relatively peripheral for these classics, and the looks are generally timeless. Aesthetics are a very important factor, and your choice of wristwear says something about you. Not in a superficial way, but it reflects your personality and understanding. Chances are slim that the wearer of a 50s chronograph can't come up with arguments that aren't financially or popularity driven to back up his choice. In a way, a vintage watch is a piece of mechanical history on your wrist. Particular brands and models often have awe-inspiring chronicles, and each individual watch have lived a long and fascinating life. There's a reason that so many companies fall back on their heritage and dredge up old designs. But nothing beats wearing an authentic artifact. They don't just tell time, they tell history. And sure, Even back in the days, they made hundreds or thousands of most models, but a vintage is still more likely to distinguish yourself from the pack. For instance, there are boatloads of vintage Rolex Datejust available. Nevertheless, the production run was considerably smaller and brands used to integrate design differences more frequently. The chances of running into another person with exactly the same configuration is fairly small, especially considering every individual timepiece has aged distinctively due to the impact of outside agents. A vintage watch is unique by default, as even identical twins grow up to be two different people. If the look of a particular old specimen captures your imagination, you'll most likely never find the exact same one ever again. It developed an unrepeatable patina and attained a soul of its own. Modern watches, while great in their own right, they don't have this differentiating feature. Those Carochrome bezels will never fade, the Super Luminova doesn't change color, and you might end up wearing the exact same watch as your neighbor. Finally, a few things can be said about the vintage market and the financial aspect. Instead of supply and demand, the retail price for new watches is set by strategy. Moreover, with new watches, the cost of development, production, marketing, and sales must be recouped. Consequently, it's harder to get value for money, regardless of the price bracket you're shopping in. Fiscally, vintage can provide benefits too. I understand new watches and modern occasions aren't the same, but both have more volatility. I'll stay clear of investing as it's a topic I rather avoid, and I shared my insight in our previous watch guide to controversial topics. Now I can hear you thinking, ease off on the sales pitch, but I'll gladly touch upon some of the risk or downsides of vintage too. With a new watch, purchased from an authorized retailer, you can be sure of authenticity, originality, condition, and proper mechanical functioning. Couple this with a good warranty, and even with a lack of experience or knowledge, you're buying a sound product. Second-hand watches introduce more risk, but might also be more exciting. Modern ones are more often counterfeited and it's harder to distinguish. With vintage, it's less uncommon for a decade-old example to have been subject to wear and or contain replaced parts. Condition and overall originality will affect the value of the watch severely. It does take years of experience and considerable knowledge to be able to navigate through these murky waters. That is why it's so important to always buy the seller. Over to the conclusion. These are the factors I weigh in to measure my personal preference for vintage. Depending on your personal parameters, you might opt for modern ones, or a healthy mix, some vintage and some modern. First and foremost, I'm a lover of watches. There are many watches that are vintage that I'm not particularly fond of, and also modern ones that I do enjoy. This argument is presented rather binary and in a generalized fashion to provoke you to think about what you value in your collection. I'm happy to hear if you disagree. Please let us know in the comments, what do you think? Rolex is and has the crown. Now over to Rolex. Ask 100 people on the streets to name a luxury watch brand, and 95 of them will probably say Rolex, whatever their gender, age, race, or nationality. It is easy to establish that there's no point in mitigating their gravity, as it is objectively the most important watch brand in history. How did their significance develop, and why do people try to deny or underplay it? Let's divide it in three segments: the product, the company, and the brand. So the product. The watches are built for daily life and to last generations. This doesn't sound groundbreaking, and nowadays many brands can say the same. But ever since the founding of the company, 12 decades ago, Rolex aimed at durability and reliability. The quality constantly improved as they innovated and shaped not only the physical product, but the entire industry. Key factors being the oyster case patenting a century ago that allowed them to make it water and dust proof, and them taking over and investing heavily in self-winding wristwatches with an improved mechanism, incorporating a rotor. Yes, it's pretty straightforward and far away from horlogerie. Not because they aren't able to make a minute repeater or tourbillon, but because they purposely steered away as they focused on aforementioned necessities. No wonder there's no elaborate finishing of the movement. It is not their core value. But in terms of precision, they've always scored very high, especially in its competitive price range, and it generally even exceeds the cost standards. Even from my own experience, as I've traded close to 10,000 watches from all brands and periods, Rolex watches are least likely to cause mechanical trouble. Even 70-year-old ones tend to have less problems than most modern models that went through our hands. And if there is an issue, it usually isn't challenging to resolve. How come? To find the answer, we have to look at the company, which is often described as conservative. They usually don't drop bombshells, and they don't bring out new lines with limited editions and totally altered models each year. Their risk aversity is to protect them from being surprised themselves. By meticulously planning things out, often decades in advance, and usually incorporating mere minor adjustments, it is easy to calculate the impact. One of the reasons why they can adopt a long-term vision and maintain such linear improvement is because there are no shareholders pushing for a quick profit. The company is owned by Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, indeed, a non-profit. Now let's not pretend it isn't an affluent firm with tremendous revenue, but at least they get to do it by their own agenda, not compromising in quality or the longevity and reputation, which arguably plays a role in the waiting list debate. So the brand. Marketing plays a huge part in the monumental success Rolex achieved. Wilsdorf started looking for exposure at a very early stage, when branding wasn't a common practice in watchmaking, let alone marketing. The name Rolex itself was most likely made up because it sounds powerful, has international potential, and it looks good on a dial. But back then, the names of watchmakers were secondary to the retailers, and it oftentimes could only be found on the inside of the case back or on the movement. Not anymore, said Wilsdorf. We are synonymous with quality, so put our name on the dial. And when Mercedes Gleitzes swam across the channel, Rolex saw a chance to capitalize on this incredible feat by letting the world know they created the greatest triumph in watchmaking. Nowadays, a brand name watch is a status symbol. This is very much because of Rolex. At an early stage, they aimed at many model lines at professionals who could use these two watches and enjoyed prestige. GMT Master for pilots, Daytona for race car drivers, Submariners for divers, etc. And don't we all admire their If You Would campaign? I mean, their logo is a crown. And how about the president bracelets for status? The quartz crisis made way for ultra-precise wristwear for a fraction of the price, and many traditional brands went out of business. But Rolex wasn't only selling their functionality. They didn't have to resort to cheap production to compete with the quartz watches, but always followed its own course. Over time, many brands looked at Rolex, but they remain often copied and never duplicated. This is just a very brief and superficial summarization of all the factors that made Rolex so staggeringly successful. But the downside to this, high winds blow on high hills. I'm not debating that the current course and availability isn't questionable, and of course your personal taste might lean towards a different brand for various reasons, depending greatly on your own criterion. I dislike the aesthetics of most modern Rolex, but over the last century they have crafted such a variety of specimens, with quality as a common denominator, that it is hard to believe you dislike them all. But more importantly, if you like watches, and I assume you do since you're watching this video, it is ludicrous to dislike Rolex as a whole, given the influence they exercise on the product across the board and the pioneering role they have adopted in business. Luckily, most people aren't short-sighted, or at the very least understand the historical importance, especially the connoisseurs and aficionados. No wonder Rolex dominates the landscape of watch collectors, making up for a large part of all the most interesting lots on auctions. And all these scholars that devoted years on making books, charts, and studies that go into the smallest details of sometimes only one model. We love this elusive and somewhat even mysterious brand. We haven't even gone into their secret communal contributions or their perpetual initiatives and immeasurable impact on society. No wonder it has peaked on top of the Forbes most reputable companies list ever so often.